The metal urn landed on the table with a hollow thunk that made Rossi flinch. He'd been a prisoner for 3 weeks, long enough to recognize the sound of American efficiency, short enough that his body still expected violence. But this wasn't violence. This was steam, rising in lazy coils from the urn's mouth, carrying a smell that stopped him mid-step. Coffee. Not the word they'd used in the Italian army for 2 years. Not the chicory paste or acorn sludge or twice-boiled ground stretched across an entire battalion. This smelled like Rome, like the cafe 2 blocks from his parents' apartment where he'd read Dante before university. Like something from a world that no longer existed. The American sergeant, Miller, they called him, wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped back from the urn. "Coffee's fresh, boys. Help yourselves. No limit." Rossi stood at the mess tent entrance, watching other prisoners approach. Cautious at first, waiting for the catch. An Italian corporal from Livorno filled a tin cup, then looked at Miller. The American was already walking away, not watching, not counting. The corporal took a sip. His eyes closed. Rossi had eaten his belt 3 weeks ago. Not the leather, they'd boiled that earlier. Just the brass fittings, sucked for the metal taste, for anything that wasn't dirt. The final week before surrender, his men had dug for roots in soil that hadn't seen rain in 4 months. They'd caught beetles, chewed them slowly to make them last. When the Americans came to Enfidaville, Rossi expected a bullet. Maybe forced labor. At minimum, the same deprivation he'd known since Kasserine, just under new management. Instead, this. He approached the urn. The coffee inside was dark, almost black. Genuine heat shimmered above the surface. He filled his cup, a real cup, metal, not a tin can with the label scraped off. The liquid scorched his palm through the metal. He lifted it to his mouth. The first taste hit his tongue like a blow. Strong, bitter, hot enough to hurt. Exactly how coffee was supposed to taste. Before the war, before the ration cards, before his mother started brewing the same grounds 4 times until the water came out gray. Rossi's hands shook, not from weakness, though he was weak, 30 pounds lighter than his enlistment weight, from the taste, from memory crashing into the present. He drank half the cup in 3 swallows, feeling it burn down his throat into his hollow stomach. Then he stood there, staring at the remaining liquid, doing mathematics that wouldn't resolve. This urn held maybe 5 gallons, 50 cups. His battalion, back when he had a battalion, received enough coffee for 1 cup per man every 3 days. If they were lucky. If supply lines held. If the quartermaster wasn't skimming. The Americans had just set out enough coffee for 50 men. For 1 morning, in a prison camp. A German captain from the Africa Corps came back for a 2nd cup. Miller was across the tent now, talking to another sergeant, paying no attention. Nobody stopped the German. Nobody marked a ledger. The man just filled his cup again and walked away. Rossi looked at his own empty cup, then at the urn. He went back. The coffee was still hot, still strong. He filled the cup to the brim this time. Some animal part of his brain screaming that this couldn't last, that he needed to take what he could before the inevitable correction. But nobody corrected him. Nobody even looked. He drank, standing beside the urn, watching the tent fill with prisoners. Italians, Germans, a few Vichy French, all of them making the same pilgrimage. All of them filling cups, waiting for someone to stop them, finding only silence and plenty. Rossi counted the trips. The Livorno corporal went back 4 times, a German sergeant. 5. Nobody stopped them. On his 3rd cup, Rossi's hands stopped shaking. The coffee settled into his stomach like ballast, like something solid after weeks of liquid deprivation. He could feel his mind clearing, synapses firing that had been dormant since the diet collapsed. That's when the real terror started. Not the fear of death. He'd made peace with that at Kasserine. Not the fear of torture or forced labor. Something worse, the fear of understanding. He'd taught literature in Perugia before the war. Logic, analysis. His students used to complain that he made them show their work, prove their conclusions. Now his mind was showing its work, and he wanted it to stop. The Americans had captured 800 prisoners at Infidaville. 800. If each man drank 3 cups, conservative estimate, that was 2,400 cups. Call it 50 gallons of coffee, in one morning, in one camp, for prisoners. Rossi's entire division, at full strength with supply lines intact, received maybe 10 gallons a day. For 3,000 men. Officers got first share. He looked at Miller, who was now refilling the urn from a second container. Not replacing, refilling. There was more. The mathematics wouldn't stop. If one camp with 800 prisoners received 50 gallons in one morning, and the Americans had camps across North Africa, and this was just coffee, just one beverage at one meal, then what? Then the war was already over. Had been over before it started. Italy had been fighting an enemy that could afford to give its prisoners more than it gave its own soldiers. Not as punishment or deprivation, but as baseline, as standard operating procedure. The propaganda made sense now. Not because it was true, but because it had to be believed. Because if you told Italian soldiers the truth, that America had so much they served ice cream in combat zones, that their factory workers ate better than European generals, that a single Liberty ship carried more cargo than Italy's entire merchant fleet, nobody would fight. You'd surrender before the first shot. Rossi's cup was empty again. He stared into it, seeing, his reflection distorted in the metal bottom. No limit, Miller had said. Rossi waited for the guards to count cups, waited for an officer to tally rations, waited for someone to announce that coffee hour was over, that they'd exceeded their allocation, that tomorrow would be different. Nobody came. The urn just sat there, steaming, full, impossible. Other prisoners were leaving now, drifting toward their morning work details with the casual confidence of men who knew there would be more coffee tomorrow. And the day after, and the day after that. Rossi stayed by the urn. He couldn't make his feet move. Not because he was afraid, but because moving meant accepting what he'd seen, and accepting meant understanding, and understanding meant everything he'd believed about this war, about courage, about sacrifice, about martial virtue triumphing over decadent materialism, was ash. He'd been told the Americans were soft, corrupted by luxury, unable to endure hardship, weak. But that wasn't what he was seeing. He was seeing an army that had so much it could waste more in a morning than his entire side could produce in a week. He was seeing men who didn't ration, didn't hoard, didn't even think about scarcity because they'd never known it. He was seeing victory coded into the system at a level deeper than tactics or courage. Miller walked past, carrying the refill container. He glanced at Rossi, still standing beside the urn, and gave a small nod. Good, right? We got a guy from New Orleans who knows how to make it proper, not like that instant shit. Then he was gone. Rossi looked at his cup, at the urn, at the tent full of prisoners who were learning the same impossible lesson. The coffee never ran out. That was the weapon. Not the tanks or the planes or the ships, the abundance, the casual, crushing, incomprehensible plenty that made kindness cheap and waste cheaper than accounting. Rossi set down his cup and walked into the North African morning. The sun was already hot. In 6 hours it would be unbearable. But somewhere in this camp, in a dozen camps, in 100 camps, there would be more coffee. As much as anyone wanted. No limit. He'd surrendered 3 weeks ago. He was only now understanding what that meant. Rossi understood camp economics. He'd understood them before the war, in the prison islands where Mussolini sent dissidents. He'd understood them acutely during the war, watching his battalion supply lines fray to threads. Cigarettes were currency. Not metaphorically, literally. A single lucky strike could buy information about which guards took bribes. 3 cigarettes could get you an extra blanket. A full pack could purchase the shoes off a dead man before they went into the communal pile. So when the Red Cross truck rolled through the compound gates on a Thursday morning, Rossi expected the familiar choreography of scarcity, some token gesture, maybe 1 pack per tent to be divided among 20 men. A carton for the senior officers, perhaps a lottery system for the rest, the mathematics of not enough. The truck stopped in the central yard. 2 American soldiers dropped the tailgate. Behind them, stacked floor to ceiling, white cartons with red crosses, thousands of them. Sergeant Miller, the coffee man, climbed into the truck bed. "Line up, gentlemen, 1 carton per man. Have your POW number ready." 1 carton. Rossi watched the first prisoner approach. A German corporal who'd been in the compound 3 months, long enough to learn the angles. The corporal offered his number, then asked in broken English, "What trade? What you want?" The American private checking numbers looked confused. "Want? Your number, that's all." "No. What I give you?" The German gestured at the cartons. "For this, what cost?" The private's confusion deepened into something like amusement. "Cost? Nothing. They're yours. Next." The German took his carton like a man accepting a live grenade. He backed away slowly, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Rossi watched this scene repeat. An Italian lieutenant asked what duties came with the cigarettes. A French sergeant offered to work extra detail. Each time, the Americans looked more baffled. Each time, they said the same thing. "They're yours. Next." When Rossi reached the truck, he didn't ask. He just offered his number and took the carton the private handed him. The weight surprised him. Solid, substantial. Real. 10 packs, 20 cigarettes per pack. 200 cigarettes total. He'd seen men killed for 20 cigarettes. Back in his tent, Rossi set the carton on his cot and stared at it. Around him, other prisoners opened theirs with trembling hands. Someone laughed, a high, slightly hysterical sound. Someone else was crying. The German corporal from the line sat on the cot across from Rossi, turning a pack over in his hands like an archaeologist examining an incomprehensible artifact. "This is 10 months' ration," he said to no one in particular. "My entire company in Stalingrad. We shared 1 cigarette between 4 men." Rossi picked up a pack. Lucky Strike. The same brand he'd seen American guards smoking casually, tossing half-finished cigarettes into the dirt. He'd watched a prisoner retrieve one of those discarded butts and smoke it down to nothing, burning his fingers on the last fragment of tobacco. That night, he calculated, 800 prisoners, 800 cartons, 160,000 cigarettes, distributed in under 2 hours, with the same casual efficiency as the coffee, as the morning rations, as everything in this impossible camp. In the Italian army, this many cigarettes would have supplied a full division for a month. Here, they were Thursday's delivery. For prisoners. He tried to sleep. Couldn't. The carton sat on the small shelf above his cot, its presence wrong in a way that made his skull ache. The next day, Rossi decided to test the economy. The mess tent served. Dinner at 1800 hours. Decent food, nothing extraordinary by American standards, but stew with actual meat, bread that was fresh, coffee that never stopped coming. Rossi had learned not to be surprised by the portions anymore, but old instincts died hard. He approached the serving line with 3 packs of Lucky Strikes in his pocket. The American cook on duty was a corporal named Jackson, a black man from somewhere called Georgia. He'd served Rossi before, always with the same efficient cheerfulness that seemed to characterize every American Rossi encountered. "Evening, Captain," Jackson said, ladling stew into a metal tray. "Corporal Jackson." Rossi accepted the tray, then pulled out the cigarettes. "I have a proposition." Jackson glanced at the packs. "Yeah?" 3 packs, for an extra portion. Rossi kept his voice low, transactional. "And perhaps some of that chocolate I've seen, the Hershey bars." Jackson's ladle stopped mid-air. He looked at the cigarettes, then at Rossi, then back at the cigarettes. Then he laughed. "Captain, you feeling all right?" "I'm quite serious." "I can see that." Jackson set down his ladle, wiped his hands on his apron. "You want more food, just ask. Why would I need your cigarettes? They have value." "Not to me they don't. PX is lousy with them." Jackson picked up a wooden crate from beneath the serving counter and showed Rossi the contents. Cartons of cigarettes, dozens of them. "Supply officer keeps giving me these to distribute. I smoke maybe 1 pack a week. Rest, just sit here." He reached into the crate, pulled out a full carton, and handed it to Rossi. "There. Now you got more cigarettes. You want extra stew too? Because I got plenty." Jackson ladled another portion onto Rossi's tray without waiting for an answer. Then he reached under the counter again and produced 3 Hershey bars. "These too. They're yesterday's. Still good." Rossi stood frozen, holding his tray with both hands now, the 4 packs of Lucky Strikes still in his pocket alongside the new carton and chocolate he hadn't traded for. "Next," Jackson called cheerfully. Rossi walked to a table in the corner and sat down. The stew was hot. The bread was soft. The chocolate was sweet and rich and American. Around him, other prisoners ate quietly, no longer surprised by plenty, beginning to accept it as the new baseline of existence. But Rossi couldn't accept it. His mind kept circling back to the mathematics that didn't work. In the Italian army, cigarettes were issued, when they were issued at all, at a rate of 5 per man per week. Officers got slightly more. He'd seen men hoard those 5 cigarettes for months, smoking them only on special occasions, treating each one like a sacrament. Here, Americans handed out 200 at a time and treated them like trash. He thought about the cigarette butts he'd seen American guards toss away. Half-smoked, sometimes barely smoked at all. He thought about Jackson's crate of surplus cartons. He thought about Miller mentioning the PX, the camp store where Americans could apparently buy more cigarettes whenever they wanted. The entire economy of his previous life had been inverted. Cigarettes weren't currency here because there was no scarcity to create value. Abundance had murdered trade. That night, Rossi watched the camp's informal market. In every POW camp he'd heard of, Italian, German, British, there was always a black market. Men trading cigarettes for food, food for clothes, clothes for information, information for protection. The economy of survival. Here, there was nothing. Some prisoners traded cigarettes, but only to other prisoners who actually wanted to smoke different brands. An Italian private swapped Camels for Lucky Strikes because he preferred the taste. A German sergeant gave away an entire pack because he didn't smoke at all, and his tent mate did. No one was building wealth. No one was accumulating power. The fundamental mechanisms of scarcity had been disabled by simple, overwhelming plenty. Rossi found the German corporal from the distribution line sitting outside his tent, smoking. "You figured it out yet?" Rossi asked in German. The corporal exhaled slowly. "That we've already lost? Yes. I figured that out in the truck line." "How?" "Because they can afford to be generous." The German took another drag. "In Stalingrad we fought for every gram. Every bullet counted, every shell was precious. We were told sacrifice would bring victory, that hardship made us strong, that the enemy was soft." He gestured at the compound around them, the electric lights, the full mess tent, the endless coffee, the worthless cigarettes. But they're not soft. They're just so fucking rich that kindness costs them nothing. You can't beat that. You can't out-sacrifice plenty. Rossi sat down beside him. They smoked in silence, burning through wealth that meant nothing, watching guards patrol with weapons they'd probably throw away if the barrels got slightly scratched. The war was still happening. Men were still dying in Italy, in France, in Russia, in the Pacific. But sitting here, smoking free cigarettes after eating free food served by men who refused payment, Rossi understood what the German corporal had already grasped. The outcome was inevitable, had always been inevitable. Not because of American courage or superior tactics, but because you cannot defeat an enemy whose supply chain is so vast that prisoner rations exceed your combat troops' provisions. Rossi finished his cigarette and immediately lit another, wasteful American, already forgetting what it felt like to ration tobacco down to the last shred. The depot stretched to the horizon, a geometry of crates and canvas that made Rossi's eyes ache. 3 football fields, maybe 4. He'd stopped trying to calculate. The Americans had asked for volunteers, another word that still felt foreign, like he was missing some cruel punchline. 30 men stepped forward. No extra cigarettes this time, just something to do, and a break from the compound's monotony. The lieutenant, young, maybe 25, Tennessee accent thick as motor oil, divided them into teams. Rossi's group got Section K, vehicle parts and mechanical supplies. "Just inventory," the lieutenant said. "Count what's in each crate, check it against the manifest, mark any damage. Simple stuff." Rossi hefted the first crate with another prisoner, a German named Kaufmann, who'd been a machinist before the war. They set it down, and Kaufmann pried it open with a crowbar. Spark plugs. Neat rows of them, each wrapped in wax paper, pristine. 100, Kaufmann counted in German, then switched to English. 100. Good condition. They moved to the next crate. More spark plugs, then another. By the 4th crate, they'd counted 400 perfect spark plugs, and the stack continued. That's when Rossi saw the Americans across the yard. 2 privates were loading a crate onto a truck bed. The crate slipped, not dropped, just slipped, and hit the truck's edge. The corner splintered. Maybe 6 inches of wood cracked. The lieutenant walked over, examined it, pulled a clipboard from under his arm. He wrote something, then gestured to a different area. "Damaged goods. Take it to the discard pile." Rossi set down the manifest he'd been checking. He walked closer, not quite believing what he'd seen. "Sir," the word came out before he could stop himself. The lieutenant turned. "Yeah? That crate. It's damaged. Corner's busted. Can't ship it like that." Rossi looked at the crack. The wood was splintered, yes, but the contents, he could see through the gap, were untouched. Wrapped, protected, perfect. "The parts inside are good," Rossi said carefully. The lieutenant shrugged. "Probably, but the documentation says delivered intact. Can't certify that with a broken crate. Regulations." Rossi watched them load the crate onto a truck that was already half full of similar casualties. A water-stained box of uniforms, ration crates with torn labels, a pallet of motor oil where one can had leaked. "What happens to it?" Rossi asked. "Junk pile. We'll salvage what we can, but most of it's not worth the paperwork." The truck drove away. Rossi stood in the African sun, watching it disappear behind a warehouse. Kaufmann appeared beside him. "You see it too? How many spark plugs in that crate? 200, maybe 250. In 1942, Rossi had watched his battalion's head mechanic receive their monthly allotment, 30 spark plugs for 47 vehicles. The man had literally wept. Rossi had seen him clean used plugs with a toothbrush, testing each one, reinstalling any that showed even marginal function. A single plug was treated like a religious artifact. These Americans had just thrown away 200 because the box was dented. The morning dissolved into counting. Rossi moved through crates, mechanically, marking tallies, his hands performing the work while his mind tried to process the mathematics. At noon, they broke for lunch. The Americans had set up a field kitchen, another impossibility, but Rossi was getting used to those. Hot soup, fresh bread, real meat. He ate standing up, unable to sit, watching the depot's rhythms. Trucks arrived, were unloaded, departed. Forklifts, actual forklifts, not men straining with handcarts, moved pallets. Everything flowed with industrial precision. A different truck pulled up to the field kitchen. 2 soldiers began loading crates from a separate pile. Rossi drifted closer. The crates were marked with red X's. He watched them load. Canned rations, the tins dented but sealed. Boxes of hardtack with water-stained corners but dry contents. Sacks of flour with small tiers that had been taped over. "Where's that going?" he asked one of the loaders. "Incinerator. Damaged goods can't go to the front. The food is still good?" The private looked at him like he'd said something obvious and irrelevant. "Probably, yeah. But it doesn't meet spec. Can't risk supply chain integrity over some dented cans." The truck's bed filled. Rossi did the mathematics without wanting to. 2 tons, maybe 3. Enough calories to feed his entire battalion for a week. More food than his village in Italy had seen in the last 6 months of the war. They were going to burn it. "You want some?" the private asked. "You boys can take what you want before we haul it off." Rossi looked at the crates. In the Italian army, in the German army, in any sane military he'd known, these supplies would be salvaged, redistributed, hoarded like gold. Here, they were offering them to prisoners as an afterthought before destruction. "No," Rossi heard himself say. "Thank you." The truck drove away. He watched the smoke rise 20 minutes later, black against the pale sky. Thousands of pounds of food becoming ash because the containers weren't perfect. The afternoon brought no relief from these revelations. In Section K, they found 3 crates of jerry cans with minor dents. The lieutenant marked them all for discard. 60 containers, each capable of holding 5 gallons. Rossi had seen Italian soldiers killed fighting over a single jerry can. By 1600 hours, the discard pile had grown to the size of a small house. Kaufman stood next to Rossi as they waited for the truck back to camp. Neither man spoke. What was there to say? They'd spent the day cataloging abundance so vast that waste was cheaper than accounting. "In Cologne," Kaufman finally said, his voice quiet. "Before I was drafted, I worked at a machine shop. When the war started, they made us account for every screw, every washer. The foreman would inspect the trash bins to make sure nothing usable was thrown away." Rossi nodded. He understood. "We saved metal shavings," Kaufman continued, "melted them down, reused everything until it was powder." They watched an American forklift move a pallet of new tires. Dozens of them. Black rubber, perfect treads, stacked like they were common as stones. "This is why we lost," Kaufman said. It wasn't a question. That night, lying on his cot, Rossi couldn't stop seeing the smoke. Black against pale blue, carrying the smell of burning food. He thought about his men at Enfidaville, boiling their belts for something to chew. He thought about the villagers near his posting in Sicily, begging for scraps from the officers' mess. He thought about his mother in Rome, writing letters about ration cards and empty shelves, and how the government said victory was near, just sacrifice a little more, a little longer. The Americans had shown him their sacrifice today. They sacrificed more in waste than Italy could produce. They threw away more than Germany could salvage. Their abundance was so complete that destruction was policy, generosity was procedure, and plenty was the baseline assumption of their entire system. You couldn't fight that. You couldn't match it. You couldn't even comprehend it from inside a worldview built on scarcity. The German corporal in the next cot rolled over. "You awake?" "Yes." "The spark plugs. How many did they throw away today?" Rossi had counted. He'd been unable to stop himself from counting. At least 800, maybe 1,000. Silence. Then, "Mein Gott." The words hung in the darkness. Outside, the camp's generators hummed, providing electricity so abundant they could light the entire compound all night. Somewhere, a radio played American swing music. The kitchen would serve breakfast in 10 hours. Real breakfast, hot coffee, enough food that men would leave portions on their plates. Rossi closed his eyes, but he still saw the smoke, still smelled it. The burning food, the discarded spark plugs, the casual destruction of materials men had died for. This was the weapon. Not the tanks or planes or ships, not courage or tactics or better generals. The weapon was a system so flush with plenty that it could afford to be careless, so abundant that waste cost less than care. How did you defeat that? How did you match an enemy that threw away your treasure? You didn't. The war was over. It had been over before it started. Everything since was just momentum, history catching up to mathematics that had been decided in Detroit factories and Pittsburgh steel mills and Iowa farms. Rossi pulled his blanket tighter, a real blanket, thick wool, American-made, and tried not to think about tomorrow's work detail, about what other impossible abundances he'd witness, about how many more illusions would burn away like food in an incinerator. But he knew he'd volunteer again. He had to see it, had to understand the full scope of what they'd been fighting against, had to know exactly how thoroughly he'd been lied to about what victory could mean. The fever arrived in waves. One moment Rossi felt chilled. The next, his skin burned like he'd been left in the August sun. His stomach twisted. The latrine became a familiar destination, each trip more exhausting than the last. By the third day, he couldn't make the walk. Someone must have noticed. Rossi barely remembered the journey to the hospital ward, just the sensation of being lifted. Voices in English he was too sick to parse. He woke in a bed with clean sheets. Not clean as in laundered once a month, clean as in white, crisp. The kind of sheets his mother had reserved for guests before the war. The pillowcase smelled faintly of soap. Real soap, not the gritty paste the Italian army had issued. A thermometer appeared in his mouth. Someone took his pulse. A cup of water materialized at his bedside, condensation running down the metal surface. Cold water. In North Africa. "Temperature's down," a voice said, American accent. "You're through the worst of it." Rossi turned his head. The medical officer wore captain's bars. Young face, maybe 30. He was writing something on a clipboard, casual as a shopkeeper taking inventory. "Thank you," Rossi managed. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got another day or two before that gut settles." The officer glanced up, offered a quick smile. "Morrison, I'm running this ward." "Captain Morrison." Rossi filed the name away, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. In Italian hospitals, in German hospitals, doctors didn't introduce themselves to prisoners. You were lucky if they bothered with diagnosis before moving to the next bed. Morrison finished his notes and left. Rossi lay still, staring at the canvas ceiling. Somewhere a radio played music. Actual music, not propaganda broadcasts. Benny Goodman, maybe. The ward held perhaps 20 beds, half of them occupied. An Italian corporal 2 beds down was reading a magazine. In Italian. Someone had given him an Italian magazine. Rossi closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept catching on details. The sheets, the cold water, the radio, the magazine, the doctor who'd smiled. The second day brought real food. Not the mess hall portions, which were already better than anything he'd eaten in uniform, but food prepared for sick men. Toast, mild soup, tea with actual sugar. A medic brought it on a tray, set it beside the bed without comment. "I can feed myself," Rossi said. The medic shrugged. "Figured, but if you can't, let me know. If you can't, let me know." As if the medic's time, his help, was just available. No negotiation required. Rossi ate the toast slowly. It was good bread. American bread, impossibly soft. The soup tasted like chicken. Real chicken, not the watered-down substitutes. He finished everything and felt human for the first time in days. That afternoon, Morrison returned during rounds. He checked Rossi's temperature again, asked about pain levels, examined his eyes with a small light. "You're doing fine," Morrison said. "Should be back on your feet by Friday." "Thank you, Captain." Morrison nodded, started to move to the next bed, then stopped. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat down. No guards, no formality. Just sat there, eye level with Rossi. "I saw in your file you speak English pretty well," Morrison said. Rossi's stomach tightened, but not from the dysentery. Here it comes, he thought. The interrogation. The favor that's really in order. The price for the clean sheets and cold water. I manage, Rossi said carefully. We're getting some new Italian prisoners next week. Maybe 100 men, straight from Sicily, probably pretty rough shape. Morrison paused. Think you could help translate? Medical stuff mostly. Making sure we're treating them right. The words didn't land at first. Rossi heard them, understood each one individually, but the sentence didn't make sense. You want me to translate? He said. Only if you want to. No pressure. Morrison gestured around the ward. But it'd help us make sure the new guys get proper care. Some of them might not speak any English. Making sure the new guys get proper care. Rossi stared at Morrison, searching for the angle, the trap, the hidden cost. In every prison he'd known, in every system, help came with strings attached. You worked for privileges. You cooperated for better treatment. You gave something to get something. You would pay me? Rossi said slowly. Standard rate for POW labor. Not much, but yeah. Standard rate for helping his own countrymen in an enemy hospital, where he was already receiving medicine and clean sheets and cold water. Morrison must have read the confusion on Rossi's face. He smiled, not a superior smile, but something easier. Look, you'd be doing us a favor. We've got medics who can patch up a wound, but if a guy's trying to explain where it hurts and we can't understand him, that's a problem. You help us help them. Simple as that. Simple as that. Rossi heard himself say, Yes, I will help. Great. Morrison stood, extended his hand. Appreciate it, Captain. The handshake lasted maybe 2 seconds. Morrison's grip was firm but not aggressive. A handshake between equals, between colleagues. Not captor and prisoner, not victor and defeated. Just 2 officers arranging a practical solution to a logistical problem. Then Morrison was gone, moving to the next bed, asking another patient about pain levels. Rossi lay back against his pillow, his clean, white pillow, and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. The Italians and Germans had told him Americans were soft, weak, corrupted by luxury and democracy, unable to make hard decisions, unwilling to sacrifice, doomed to lose against superior martial spirit. But that wasn't what he'd seen. He'd seen an army with so much abundance it could afford clean sheets for prisoners, so much food it could prepare special meals for sick enemies, so much medicine it treated dysentery like a minor inconvenience instead of a potential death sentence. So much confidence in its own victory it could pay prisoners to help other prisoners. Morrison wasn't being exceptionally kind. This was the baseline, the default setting, the system running normally. In Italian camps, prisoners died of diseases that went untreated. In German hospitals, medicine was rationed for soldiers who mattered. Rossi had seen men lose limbs because there wasn't enough antiseptic, had watched friends die from infections that clean bandages might have stopped. These Americans threw away spark plugs, burned food, gave away cigarettes, served unlimited coffee, and treated enemy prisoners better than the Italian army had treated its own men. Not because Morrison was a saint. Because the system had so much, kindness cost nothing. You couldn't defeat that. You couldn't match that level of power with courage or tactics or superior marksmanship. The war wasn't being won in North Africa or Italy or the Atlantic. It had already been won in the factories, the farms, the supply chains, the vast engine of American production that made abundance the default and scarcity obsolete. Rossi thought about his men at Enfidaville, eating belts, digging for roots, dying slowly while they waited for supplies that never came. He thought about the spark plugs in the trash pile, the burned food, the unlimited coffee. He thought about Morrison's handshake. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in his clean bed in his enemy's hospital, listening to Benny Goodman on the radio, and understood with absolute certainty that everything he'd believed about this war had been a lie. Not just propaganda. A fundamental misunderstanding of what they were fighting. Italy had brought swords to a mechanized age. They'd brought pride to fight plenty. They'd brought martial virtue to face industrial might. And they'd lost before the first shot was fired. The radio played on. Somewhere a medic laughed at a joke. The Italian corporal turned a page in his magazine. Outside, the North African night was cool and clear. Rossi closed his eyes and saw Morrison's extended hand. Felt again that simple, devastating handshake. The war wasn't over yet. Men were still dying. But the outcome had never been in doubt. You could see it in every detail of this place. In the waste, the abundance, the casual kindness. America hadn't just built more tanks and planes. It had built a system where victory was the default setting and generosity cost nothing. By Friday, Rossi was back on his feet. Morrison cleared him for return to the general camp. Before he left, Rossi asked when the new prisoners would arrive. "Tuesday, probably," Morrison said. "You still good to help?" Rossi nodded. "Good man. See you then." That was all. No ceremony, no gratitude. Just the simple assumption that, of course, Rossi would do what he'd agreed to do, because that's how things worked in a system built on abundance rather than scarcity. Rossi walked back to his tent in the bright African morning, physically recovered but mentally transformed. The coffee had been the first crack. The cigarettes had widened it. The waste at the depot had deepened it. But Morrison's handshake had shattered everything. He was still a prisoner, still Italian, still technically the enemy. But he knew now, with absolute certainty, which side had already won. And eventually, he knew, he would find a way to join them. Rome, 1946. The apartment smelled of plaster dust and failure. Rossi sat at the scarred wooden table while his cousin Franco paced the narrow room, gesturing at walls that still bore shrapnel scars from the liberation. Outside, children played in the rubble of what had been the Benedetti pharmacy. A year after the war's end, the pharmacy was still rubble. "Argentina," Franco said again, spreading a crumpled map across the table. "Buenos Aires. Luigi's brother went last month. Says there's work, real work, construction. The city is growing." Rossi watched Franco's finger trace an imaginary route across the Atlantic. His cousin had lost weight. They all had, and the suit he wore hung loose across his shoulders. It had been their uncle's suit. Their uncle was buried under what remained of the railway station. "What's here?" Franco swept his hand toward the window. "Scarcity. Lines for bread. Lines for work. Lines for everything. And at the end of every line, nothing." He lit a cigarette, one of the cheap local ones that tasted like burning rope. "Italy's finished, Giovanni. Europe's finished." Rossi said nothing. He was thinking about coffee. Franco mistook his silence for doubt. "I know what you're thinking. Leave the homeland? Abandon Italy?" He laughed, a bitter sound. "Italy abandoned us first. Mussolini's grand empire. Look what it bought us." Through the thin walls, Rossi heard Signora Moretti coughing. She'd been coughing since October. There was no medicine. There hadn't been medicine for anything in 2 years. "Come with us," Franco said, sitting down heavily. "Maria and we're leaving in May. There's room on the ship. You could bring Anna, the children. Start fresh. Where would we go? I told you, Buenos Aires. Or Sao Paulo. There are Italians there too. Anywhere but here." Rossi reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers found the letter, its paper soft from handling. He'd read it 17 times. 18 if you counted this morning. "What about America?" he heard himself say. The words hung in the dusty air. Franco stared at him. Then he laughed, really laughed, bent over the table, wheezing. "America! Cristo Giovanni! America!" He wiped his eyes. "You think they'd take us? We were the enemy. We shot at them. Their boys died pushing us up the peninsula." Rossi pulled the letter from his pocket and set it on the table. Franco's laughter died. He looked at the envelope, at the American stamps, at the return address written in neat block letters. "What is that?" "A letter." I can see it's a letter. From who? Captain Morrison. He was the medical officer at the POW camp. Franco picked up the envelope, turning it over like it might be a trick. Your jailer is writing you letters. He's asking if I made it home safely. Rossi kept his voice level. If there's anything I need. Anything you... Franco put the envelope down, carefully, like it might burn him. Giovanni, what are you talking about? Rossi thought about how to explain. He'd been trying to explain for months. To Anna, to old friends, to himself. The words never came out right. How did you describe something that had to be experienced? The coffee, he started, then stopped. They had coffee, real coffee, in the camp. Franco was looking at him with concern now, the way you looked at someone whose mind had broken. That's good, Giovanni. I'm glad they fed you. No. Rossi leaned forward. You don't understand. They didn't just feed us. They gave us coffee, fresh coffee. As much as we wanted, every morning. The urn never ran out. Okay. Cigarettes, a carton each, 200 cigarettes. Just gave them to us. They wanted something. Nothing. They wanted nothing. I tried to trade for extra food and the cook just gave it to me. Wouldn't take the cigarettes. Said the PX had too many already. Franco was quiet now, watching him. I worked at a supply depot, Rossi continued. The words were coming faster. They threw away spark plugs, brand new ones. The crate was dented, so they threw away 200 spark plugs. I watched them burn food, good food, sealed cans, because the paperwork was wrong. Giovanni. They paid me. Rossi's voice cracked. In the hospital, when I was sick, the American doctor asked me to translate for new prisoners, to help make sure they were treated well, and he paid me. Shook my hand and paid me to help care for my own countrymen. The room was silent except for Signora Moretti's coughing. Franco spoke carefully. You were in a camp, a prison camp. They were guarding you. I know what I was in. Rossi stood, walked to the window. In the street below, 2 men were arguing over a broken cart. I know what we did, Franco. I know we were the enemy. But you didn't see what I saw. What did you see? Rossi watched the men fight over the cart's axle, both trying to claim the salvageable parts. He thought about the junk pile at the depot, mountains of material better than anything in this street. An army that had so much they could afford to be kind, he said quietly. Not kind like charity. Kind like breathing. Like it cost them nothing because they had everything. He turned back to Franco. You talk about Argentina, about starting over, but you're thinking small. You're thinking about escaping scarcity, going somewhere with less competition for scraps. And you're thinking what? That America wants Italian veterans? Rossi picked up the letter. Morrison's handwriting was clear, the English formal but warm. I hope this finds you and your family well. If there is anything you need, please don't hesitate to write. I'm thinking that I watched them throw away more in a day than we produced in a month, Rossi said. I'm thinking that the war wasn't lost at Enfidaville or Monte Cassino. It was lost before it started, before the first shot. We brought courage and sacrifice to a fight against abundance. Franco was shaking his head. They'll never let you in. Morrison said there are programs. For refugees. For people with skills. Rossi sat down again. I speak English. I taught literature. Anna can sew. You shot at them. And they gave me coffee anyway. Rossi met his cousin's eyes. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Franco. That's what you don't understand. They gave us coffee, unlimited coffee, to prisoners, to enemies, because that's just what they do. Outside, the argument over the cart had turned physical. The 2 men grappled in the dust while others gathered to watch. Franco looked at the letter again. You really think you could go there? To America? Rossi thought about Sergeant Miller setting down the urn, about Jackson at the mess tent, pushing food across the counter. about Morrison's handshake, firm and equal, treating him like a colleague instead of a prisoner. I think I'd be a fool not to try. Franco was quiet for a long time. Then, "What would you do there?" "Work. Whatever work there is." Morrison mentioned factories, manufacturing. They're building things, making things. Rossi allowed himself a small smile. "Probably throwing things away." "You're serious?" "Completely." Franco lit another terrible cigarette. Through the smoke, he studied his cousin's face. "You really think it's different there? That it's not just propaganda? American lies to make themselves look good?" Rossi thought about how to answer. He remembered the first morning, standing by the coffee urn. The smell had made him cry, actually cry, because it reminded him of his father's cafe, of Sunday mornings before the world broke. He'd drunk 3 cups waiting for the trap, for the cost, for the other shoe to drop. It never did. "I don't think you can fake abundance," he said finally. "Not the way I saw it. You can fake generosity, give a little, make a show. But waste, casual, thoughtless waste of things that could keep men alive?" He shook his head. "That's real. That's what happens when you have so much you've forgotten what scarcity feels like." The children outside were singing something, a game Rossi recognized from his own childhood. The melody carried through the broken window, high and clear. Franco stubbed out his cigarette. "If you go, you'll write?" "Of course." "And if it doesn't work? If they turn you away?" Rossi folded Morrison's letter carefully, returning it to his pocket. "Then I'll know I tried to go toward plenty instead of running from lack. That has to count for something." Franco nodded slowly. He looked tired, older than his, 36 years. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am thinking small." "Come with us," Rossi said. "America instead of Argentina. Maria wants Buenos Aires. She has family there. Think about it." "I'll think about it." They sat in silence as the afternoon light slanted through the damaged window. Somewhere in the building, someone was cooking. The smell of thin soup, more water than vegetables. Rossi thought about the mess tent, about portions that satisfied, about seconds you didn't have to beg for. "When would you go?" Franco asked. "As soon as I can arrange it. Spring, maybe. Summer at the latest." "That's fast." "There's nothing keeping me here." Franco looked around the apartment, the scarred furniture, the cracked walls, the water stain spreading across the ceiling. "No," he admitted. "I suppose there isn't." Rossi would leave in April 1947. He would bring Anna and the children to Rhode Island. He would work at a factory that made electrical components, and he would marvel, every single day, at the machines that stamped out parts by the thousands. He would become a citizen. He would name his son Morrison. But he never forgot the coffee. Years later,